The first sound Isolde heard was the crack of bone, lighter than a tree snapping, closer to the way a promise breaks. And she knew, with the simple arithmetic of bodies and blood, that someone had been betrayed under the wolf flag beyond the eastern ridge. She stepped forward anyway, the leather of her booted foot whispering against the packed earth, the limp pressing a familiar protest through her hip. Moonlight sliced through the pines like knives. It did not matter to her that her sight was a rumor she kept to herself. She navigated by memory, by the way the air changed when a wounded animal exhaled its last, by the vibration of fear. When she crossed the trampled clearing, the shape on the ground was more shadow than figure. Men had a way of collapsing like felled trees, but she smelled copper and rank fur. A beta, judging by the size of the shoulders. Someone had tried to take him. The world told her she should not be in this moment. The world had always told her not to be the one to answer a crack of bone. She knelt and put her palm to the dark slick of blood and fur, and the pack, which watched from the lip of the trees, decided whether its heiress could touch what it refused to tame. Wait, before the next revelation unfolds. If this story has already captured your heart, let us know where you're following from. To ensure you don't miss unexpected twists, emotional reconciliations, or new beginnings, subscribe and stay connected. Now back to the story. Isolde's fingers stayed where the beta's pulse thudded beneath dirt and fur. She felt for the cadence of life, as if she could coax it awake by listening alone. The pack's breath around her tightened like a noose, and she knew all their faces by the prick of their attention. The silent disdain of the betas who wanted her bloodline but not her body. The shifty calculation of cousins who measured her as less than a throne. The flatness in her mother's voice when she spoke Isolde's name, as if it were a coin dropped into a well. Isolde's father had taught her to listen for the truth inside a room, but he had also taught her to keep one truth private, her blindness, because in a world of claws and contest, weakness invited knives. "Get up," she said to the wounded beta, and the word was a command that surprised even her. Her voice had a baritone that came from leaning into storms when the rest of the pack cowered from wind. The beta coughed, eyes unfogging. His pupils were the gray of river rock and haunted by the sight of a face he did not expect to see, Isolde's face, tilted toward him in the silver dark. He flinched at her hand, not because he mistrusted her touch, but because the pack's instinct told him to fear the heiress who limped. Fear is contagious, she thought. Loyalty is not. "She shouldn't be here," a voice hissed from the trees, which meant that someone important was splitting the air with a pretense of concern. "We should have sent scouts." Isolde did not answer the accusation with words that would have only reaffirmed their prejudice. Instead, she tightened the bandage on the beta's shoulder, knotting the cloth with sure movements, learned from nights alone with moonlit injuries when no one had thought her presence necessary or beneficial. The pack kept saying that their next leader needed to be flawless, unwounded, unquestioned, visible, and they uttered their criteria like scripture, while their hands reached for knives. But leadership is not always the mask they carved into statues. Sometimes leadership is a hand that doesn't flinch. He woke fully then and recognized her name in the darkness. Isolde spoke it like a benediction, and she felt the watchful chorus of murmurs ripple through the pines. It was the same ritual at every low moment of her life. Acknowledgement, then erasure. The Àlpha's son, her cousin Alder, stepped into the clearing, towering and clean, his jaw a blade honed for command. He smelled of sharp leather and the ambition that always smells like thunder before lightning. His eyes narrowed when they reached her face. "You should be resting inside the den," he said, as though the world were a fireplace and not a battlefield. I was already resting, Isolde answered. She felt the tremor in her chest like a warning bell. But someone needed help. Did you think the thorns raised only those who can run without remembering how to limp? His laugh was small and bitter and meant to slice. We raised those who can lead. A pack dies under a broken crown. Her mouth flattened, then curved, not in acceptance, but in something like defiance. A crown isn't the only shape of leadership, she said softly. You would do well to remember that not every war needs to be fought by hands that run the fastest. For a moment, there was silence heavier than grief. Even the wounded beta listened, learning the cadence of an heiress who spoke common truths like proverbs. That was the moment Jonna Hale stepped up the ridge. He smelled like cedar and old hospital rooms and rain, clean human scents that cut through the forest musk like a sudden sun. When he appeared at the tree line, his hands were stained with ointment. A satchel hung from his shoulder, full of vials and bandages. He carried no weapon, which in Thornland was a declaration in itself. His eyes were the color of wet steel and held a constant undercurrent of apology, as if he had learned the world tends to need atonement for its survival, and he paid in small, earnest currencies. He had been a wildlife medic for years, moving between human villages and the edges of lichen territories, learning where the living met the wild and how to stitch those edges back together. He had come to the ridge 3 nights ago to treat a torn shoulder for a hunting party, and his hands had bled the truth into a rumor that spiraled faster than wildfire. Jonna had saved a lichen's life. Isolde felt him before she heard him, an awareness not sighted but sensed, like the way rain announces itself through smell. He stepped into the clearing with no ceremony and knelt beside the wounded beta. His breathing, he reported simply. His voice was practiced in the hush of grief and efficiency. He'll live if we move him. There's infection starting. And you are, Alder demanded, suspicion sharpening his tone. Jonah's glance landed on Isolde like an unplanned light. He didn't skirt his eyes away when he learned what he could not see. If anything, his gaze seemed to lean toward her with genuine curiosity. And for the first time in years, a small, combustible ember, Isolde felt the thorn of being seen as more than a liability. The pack did not like humans touching their wounds without profit. The thorns measured every hand that served with suspicion. But Jonah's presence had already altered the geometry of the clearing. He treated the injured beta with quiet competence, palms learning the muscle memory of a species that wasn't his own. And the pack, hungry for life in a night that kept offering loss, watched with the complicated eyes of those who feared both the enemy and the healer. When he stood, Jonna brushed his sleeves and offered Isolde his hand, the way a stranger in a crowded market offers coins. "I'm Jonna Hale," he said. "I don't have a title." She took his hand anyway, because there are times when a human hand is the most honest thing in a forest of pretense. His fingers were calloused, steady, and when he squeezed, the contact was not pity, but recognition. "Isolde Thorn," she answered. Her name on his tongue was not an accusation. The pack made a collective, uncomfortable exhale as if breath could be used to weigh judgment. "You shouldn't be out here," Alder said, sharper than before. "You should be home." "Perhaps you'd like to go home and try sitting in a throne built for someone who can see," Isolde murmured. It was an old retort, but one that cut to the marrow of everyone who believed sight equaled right. Alder's jaw clenched. Pride had a taste they both knew too well. Jonna watched them like someone attempting to read the weather in a foreign language. "You all have rules," he said. "I grew up with them. But I learned to break a few when the choice was between rules and someone dying." That line landed on Isolde with a soft, dangerous hope. Breaking rules had given her bruises and solitude, but the cause had rarely been anyone she could trust to stay. Jonna's admission was simple and dangerous both. He did not come offering chains of allegiance, but a hand to steady a moment. The idea of a human offering anything more to a thorn, let alone to an heiress who limped and could not see the banners, is obscene to the pack. To accept such a thing would be to invite scorn and perhaps challenge. "You shouldn't take favors from humans," Alder said, studying Jonah as if he were cartilage to be tested. "They don't belong in thorn rituals. They don't carry blood. They cannot bond." Jonah's jaw tightened, and for the first flicker in the clearing, he looked almost as wounded as the beta on the ground. "I've seen people who claim to belong to nothing," he said. "I've seen packs die because they insisted on perfect leaders and perfect lineage. I won't stand by and watch when a person's life is at stake because of your rules." Isolde felt the ground under her feet tilt. Here was a man who had no grandeur, no promise of power, just a stubborn reluctance to be complicit in silence. There was something dangerous, almost sacrilegious, in the way he refused to be bowed by law when law was cruelty in disguise. She thought of the nights she listened to the pack debate how to sacrifice outliers for the prosperity of the whole, and her chest ached with the knowledge that she had been bartered in whispers. "Why help us?" she asked finally, not entirely sure if she wanted his answer. "You don't owe the thorns anything." Jonah's answer made the hairs on her forearm rise. "Because someone taught me that keeping quiet is the same as choosing the wrong side," he said. "And because once, when I stayed silent, people paid for it with their lives." That confession folded the edges of Jonah into the space of the clearing. It was a minute, a sliver of a thing, but it made him larger in the way remorse makes a person wider, fuller, more dangerous, more alive. Isolde imagined the cost of his learning, the shape of guilt that had driven him away from his villages and into the forests where he now walked among wolves with no weapon but a satchel of salves. "You'll make enemies," Alder warned. "Human hands on thorn soil will be used against us. Rivals will say we are weak. They'll declare our leadership broken." Isolde heard the whisper of the rival pack like a distant tide already turning. She had felt it for months, hungry eyes watching the borders, waiting for the scent of salt in a wound. She also felt in her chest the small, crackling possibility of partnership that wasn't ownership. To bond with a human was heresy. To bond with a man who did not profit from the thorn name was lunacy. Yet when Jonah looked at her again, something in his gaze said he did not see her as the rumor the pack had made of her. He saw someone who would choose because the world had taught him the cost of not choosing. "Stay," Isolde said to him, as much a mercy as a challenge. "Stay, and we'll see if your hands are as steady as your words." Jonah nodded. The movement tolerated the gravity of choice. Around them, thorns shifted, some elbows bracing for disapproval, others leaning forward as if this could be a scandal to sharpen into opportunity. Isolde knew the price of being at the center of such a storm: scorn, isolation, maybe danger. She also felt the curious warmth of a possible alliance that was not built on tribute and violence. That night, as the pack retreated into their den to whisper about the scandal before it happened, Isolde stayed outside beneath the tree line. Jonah sat across from her, the satchel between them like a small island of utility. He did not ask to touch her hands again. He did not offer pity. He simply said, "You didn't have to come tonight." "Someone needed me," Isolde replied, "and someone needed you to answer." The moon traced the curve of the world. A fox somewhere barked its small, defiant claim. The park of flags, the thorns banners stitched from old hunts, shivered in the wind. For a pack that had always measured power by blood and sight, the night had become a place where new measures might be learned. Isolde felt the tremor of possibility, but beneath it, like a true current, ran the knowledge that nothing in Thornland ever changed without a reckoning. She could accept Jonah's presence and the risk it invited, but she could not ignore that within the man who offered his hand was a past that might not go quietly into the dark. The first time Jonah reached for the side of Isolde's case, she startled, as if someone had spoken her name aloud in a den of sleeping wolves. He did not touch with the curiosity of a stranger. His fingers hovered, then rested on bone and hair with reverence, as if tracing the topography of a map that had been handed to him in trust. "You have a scar," he said softly, voice low so the pines couldn't carry it to the pack's waiting ears, "along your jaw." Isolde blinked into the dark that was more familiar than light. Some people felt touched by words. She was touched by hands that learned her edges instead of pressing to own them. "A take from a crate I refused to let fall on me when I was a child," she answered. "It keeps my cheek warm in winter." Jonah smiled then, half apology, half a small private joy, and the sound felt like a lighthouse in a storm-wrecked harbor. Still, the clearing hummed with coiled judgment. The thorns were a chorus learning a discordant new song. Jonah's presence had scratched the surface of ritual and tradition, and the notes did not fit yet. The betas watched the exchange between human and heiress like a pack watching the birth of an idea that might be contagious. Alder's silence did not lighten. Instead, it seemed to thicken with plotting. "Stay with me tonight," Isolde said before she could overthink it into treason. "Inside the den, the wind is sharp." He hesitated, not because he feared the den, but because to accept shelter under Thornwood was to step into an intimacy the pack had long vetted and bargained over. "You'll sleep by the outer fire," he offered. "You'll keep watch." "It would be better if you didn't," Alder said, from the lip of the trees where he had waited, his voice sandpapered. "Humans draw attention." Jonah's jaw hardened like a shutter closing against a storm. "Then perhaps attention is what you need," he shot back quietly. "If your people listen to the sharpness of the wind and the crack of bone, but choose silence, they'll lose more than pride." Alder's teeth bared in a politician's grimace. He moved as if to answer with claws, but the Àlpha, Isolde's father, had not yet spoken, and the clearing was a chessboard of weighing glances. Isolde heard the pull of loyalty in her blood like the pull of tide. She had been taught that pleasing the pack was the right form of oxygen. But there was also a fierceness in her that grew like a muscle when tested, and it matched the stubbornness in Jonah's stance. When the pack finally dispersed, muttering their consternation and wrath into the night, Isolde led Jonah to the den's threshold. The hollow was lined with pelts and old trophies. It smelled of smoke and iron. Inside, where the air was warmer and people spoke less loudly because the walls themselves listened, she could let the mask of heiress fall away. Jonah followed, sat near the outermost fire, and drank the quiet like water. "You carry stories," she said, more statement than question. "There's a kind of grief that sets in the bones of those who have tended to wounds for other people's mistakes." He did not flinch at the nakedness of her observation. "There's a difference between tending a wound and stitching a lie over one." He picked at the frayed edge of his satchel. "I was blamed once for choosing the wrong cure. The leader I treated lost his roar. He lived, so they said I had saved life, but his clan lost faith in his dominance, and the consequences were war. People I knew were killed because I gave medicine that took something else they valued. They called me a coward for saving blood at the cost of strength." Isolde listened to the confession and felt, brick by slow brick, the architecture of a man who had been taught that mercy could be a crime. "You were the only one who could make that choice," she said. "That makes you braver than the ones who hid behind tradition." "Maybe," Jonah said. He had the look of someone who had rehearsed apologies for years and found them inadequate. Mostly, it made me a target. Of who? Rivals and time, Jonah answered. He didn't say the name of the rival pack that had never forgiven him for what they called sabotage. He didn't say that the leader who lost his dominance had been their leader's brother once, details that would paint bloodlines across the map. Words in Thornland carried weight. Silence sometimes carried more. The next morning, the pack woke to a ring of frost and an absence of predictability. Isolde moved through the den as if through water, taking the temperature of conversations. The betas clustered in their usual knots, but now, under the weight of Jonah's presence, their knots had frayed threads. Some of them watched Jonah with guarded gratitude. Lives saved were news that could not be dismissed, while others measured him for the knife he'd surely bring in his wake. Rumors were fast-growing creatures that nested where doubt made room. "You're making things worse," her mother called Isolde that dawn. The voice had the strain of a woman who loved her family and feared the tearing of its fabric. "A human can't bind to us. It would be a stain. The elders will demand we break any contact." Isolde's reply was a storm that had been brewing for years. "Do you love the pack more than you love who I am?" she asked. Her mother flinched as though the words had physical form. If the thorns would rather burn a bridge to hide a shame than learn, then perhaps our road was never as wide as we claimed. It was a cruelty, the way loyalty sometimes masqueraded as preservation. Her mother, who had once kissed the small crown of Isolde's scalp and promised protection, now mirrored the pack's consensus, fear of contagion over curiosity. Isolde felt hollowed by the trade. She had wanted allies within her family, not merely officials in her court. That afternoon, Jonah and Isolde walked the border where the pines thinned and the world opened to low fields. He offered to guide by scent and sound, an odd audition perhaps for a world that measured leadership by sight and quick jaws. He let her take his arm, not with ownership but with steadying affection, and she leaned into him the way one learns to trust a voice in blindness, by the accuracy and kindness in it. Around them, the wind scolded the flags stitched with old kills. The Thornland sky sat heavily like a hand that might crush. "You could leave," Jonah said at one point, voice nearly lost to distance. "Walk back to your villages. The world outside Thorn might not understand what it means to carry a pack's name, but they'll measure you by different scales." "Leave?" Isolde echoed. "I've been exiled in my own house for years. Where would I go that wasn't simultaneously a sentence? The Thorns are my people, Jonah. Even if they refuse me, I still feel the ache of their choice at the tips of my bones." "Why keep fighting for a pack that won't take you?" he asked gently. "Because I wasn't raised to abandon my people," she said. "Because leadership isn't only a title to be relinquished when the world dismisses you. My father raised me to understand the pack's shape, so I could mend it, not flee it." They walked in silence after that, their footsteps folding into the pines like a secret being told. Jonah's hand found hers, a deliberate, careful clasp. It was not what the Thorns expected from their heiress. It wasn't meant to be. It was, however, a small revolution that made both of them breathe a fraction differently. At the edge of the boundary, a messenger awaited, a young scout with eyes like startled coal. He carried news that smelled of smoke and old grudges. "They've been spotted near the river," he said, voice quivering. "The Black Row pack. They test our borders now." Isolde's heart became a stone that remembered how to roll. The Black Rows were old rivals, a pack who believed in purity and the iron rule of dominance. They would use Jonah's past as a brand, a story to set aflame the Thorns' precarious standing. Isolde felt that burn already. "Did they leave marks?" she asked. "Words? Flags?" "They left a token at the creek, a bone tied with black thread," the scout answered. "They call it a challenge." Jonah's face hardened. "They'll want a reason," he said. "They love the theater of accusation. If they can say I'm the man who weakened a leader, they'll claim you as unfit, Isolde. They'll say you chose a spy to shame the Thorns." Isolde's fingers tightened on his arm. The chest ached with premonitions. The way the pack's council would fold around the accusation. The way aldermen would use scandal as an arrowhead. The way her mother might finally concede to the pack's demand to cast her out. She imagined the line of Thornland faces twisting, the ripple of betrayal across generations. But she also imagined the alternative, a life in which a human had made a promise and left, a life where Jonah's absence would be yet another kind of wound. "Then well show them otherwise," she said, not with the boldness of some invincible leader, but with the marrow-true knowledge of someone who had chosen to stay in the roar of the storm. "We will not surrender to rumor." Jonah's lips pressed together. "We will not fight a battle for honor's sake alone," he murmured. "We'll fight to protect people." So plans were made, not of war, but of presence. Isolde ordered scouts to circle the creek and remove any Black Row tokens, to bring back evidence of the intruders without the spectacle. She would not allow a dramatic claim to be made of her choices. Yet even as she marshaled actions, the inner friction of being an heiress who limped and who could not see nagged at her. Every measured move would be seen as performance, not necessity. The Thorns were suspicious of efficacy that looked nothing like their veneer. A hidden leadership looked like weakness to those who equated leadership with trophies. That night, as moonlight poured like silver water over the ridge, a fox's call cut through the den. Outside, near the creek, someone laughed, too loud, too human, and the sound carried. Within minutes, the Thorns were alert. The Black Rows, it seemed, were not satisfied with anonymous tokens. They wanted spectacle. A raid was staged at the northern border, a flurry of movement and barking that was designed to be seen more than to kill. It was meant to scandalize. Isolde and Jonah ran toward the clash like two halves of something unformed and bold. He moved with the steadiness of someone used to sudden violence. She moved like someone who had become intimate with the sound of breaking things and with the ways to put them back together. Together, they crossed a line Thornland had never seen before. A human and an Àlpha blood heiress in the middle of a field where the music of battle made even the best intuition betray itself. The push came then, hard and raw. Betas ran to position. Claws flashed. The Black Rows wanted more than territory. They wanted to unmake a future that smelled like new possibility. Their leader, a broad-shouldered wolf with eyes like coal and teeth bared, stepped forward with a grin that had the pleasure of cruelty. He had heard the rumors about Jonah, and his mouth was ready to pronounce judgment before the first blade sang. Isolde felt Jonah's hand close around hers, like an oath. She could not see the rival Àlpha, but she did not need to. She felt the wave of aggression through the pack, the way their fear sought a human-shaped scapegoat. Her body tightened. Her limp reminded her that she carried a physicality that some would use to mock her. But she also felt something stronger, the fact that she had chosen this man, and that his choosing had been his own, not forced by gratitude or debt. That knowledge steadied her spine. "Stand with me," she whispered to the Thorns. "Stand for life." It was not a call to violence. It was a call to claim that even a leader who limped and lived in darkness could speak commands that mattered. Alder's eyes were fire. He did not move to slam a charge, but to watch for opportunities that would embroider him in power. The Thorns, rattled but not ready to crumble, took their places. Jonah moved like a man who had been told he could not belong and decided, in answer, to belong anyway. He stood beside Isolde, neither above nor below, and together they prepared to make the wrong choice into the right one. The Black Rose first volley was noise and test. Their second was hunger. The night would remember the smell of dust and spilled promises. But at the end of it, as limbs and flags were gathered and the Black Rose retreated muttering of revenge and rumor, the thorns were intact, though not unscarred. Jonah had bled for them. Isolde had been seen by hands that were not of the pack. Alder had not been humiliated but had lost access. And in the small quiet after the rush of blades, when the den hummed with the low sound of wounds tending to their edges, Isolde realized that the greatest obstacle was not the rival pack's teeth, but the way her own people wanted to keep measuring her by what she lacked. Jonah sat across from her that night, pressing a cloth to a shallow cut on his forearm. "They will make stories," he said. "They'll say this proves you soft. They'll say I'm a spy." Isolde felt a tiredness she could no longer name. "Let them," she said, voice as flat as an old coin. "We did what was necessary. We saved lives. That will have to be enough." But her hand, blind, scarred, steady, found his, and their fingers twisted together with a promise that was not yet named. Outside, the flags snapped in a wind that had not decided whether it would bring storm or clearing. Inside, in the dark, Isolde and Jonah held the small, dangerous warmth of something neither of them had expected, but both of them would fight to keep. The next morning, the pack's whispers were a living thing, a low wind that hunted the den and slipped into corners. Isolde woke with Jonah's hand still folded over hers, warm and stubborn as a secret. The scrape of boots and the murmur of counsels had already begun. Alder moved through meetings like an inquisitor, ready to press the pack's fears into law. Isolde listened from where she had slept, the world mapped by sound and the slow cartography of pain. She had thought battle was the worst the thorns could suffer. She had not yet learned the violence of stories. They came at her in fragments at first, a sharp glance from a cousin, the sudden tightening in the midwife's face when she handed Isolde herbs. A child asked aloud why the heiress walked as if the ground had betrayed her. Each small thing was a stone thrown to test how long a bridge could take being pelted before it buckled. Her mother avoided meeting her in full light. The elder women offered condolences that felt like verdicts. Even allies who had once admired Isolde's stubbornness began to measure their loyalty in inches, afraid that proximity to scandal would dirty their hides. "You're reckless," Alder told her in the dense council room, where Pelt's muffled footsteps and faces felt closer than they were. The men and women at the table mirrored him, closed in a semicircle of tight mouths. "You let a human in our hollow. You invited the Black Rose to stain us with rumors." Isolde's voice did not tremble. "I let him help when we had a man on the ground who might have died." "A human," Alder repeated, as if the word itself was an accusation carved into bone. "A human whose past is a crown of suspicion. You don't understand how this looks to other packs." She understood exactly how it looked, she thought, the way a woman knows precisely what her dress says to enemies and allies both. But she also understood another truth, one no one at that table would name aloud. The thorns were built on the backs of those they discarded. "You fear what you do not control," she said finally. "If your concern is not for the living but for appearances, then this pack is failing at what it was meant to be." The room splintered into sharper accusations, loyalty twisted into scandal. Alder's supporters blinked hard when Isolde's words did not fold. Fear was starting to look like cowardice. And yet, even as she defended herself, there were fissures beneath her feet. Betas who had kept their distance now wandered mouths full of questions they were not yet ready to ask. If she had stood alone, those fissures might have widened into gulfs. Jonah filled them in ways she could not, by tending bruises, by taking positions at patrols, by refusing to be diminished into a rumor. But the Black Rose were cunning beyond displays. They did not simply spread rumor. They constructed a narrative and handed it to the Thorns like a prayer book. A messenger arrived mid-afternoon, breath like smoke, and dropped a single sewn token on the council table. A scrap of cloth dyed black with a symbol the Thorns recognized as a brand of shame. Alongside it came a list of claims. Jonah's name twisted into accusations. Sabotage, allying with outsiders to render leaders weak, betraying a clan for mercy. The list was a blade with a clean edge. "He's nothing but a spy," one beta choked out, voice thin as a reed. The words landed on Isolde like cold water. Jonah's hand tightened in hers under the table, an anchor she had no right to need but could not deny. He did not speak yet. His breathing was steady, the calm after a storm forming inside him as a strategy. He had been accused like this before. It had carved him, shaped him into someone who could be quiet and precise when the world demanded explanation. Isolde stood. The room seemed to lean in, hunting for a collapse. "I asked him to stay," she said. "He chose to help when a life hung in balance. If you would call that betrayal, then I ask, what are you asking of me? To become what you want me to be so you can sleep? Or to lead in a way that keeps us alive?" Alder's face curled with old hurt and younger ambition. "You will not decide this alone," he said. "The elders will vote. If they decide that you will cast me out," Isolde finished for him. Her voice was not angry in a way that shouted. It cut as if carefully honed. "That you will make me a cautionary story. If that is how you choose to preserve the Thorns, then perhaps the Thorns were never the home I believed." The elders retreated into silence, and for one brittle moment, Isolde felt the full cruelty of being both inside a tribe and outside its sanctum, something beloved and betrayer in the same skin. Jonah's fingers rubbed the edge of hers, then tightened almost imperceptibly. He had his own shadows to reckon with. This room was not designed to consider them without spilling blood. The vote slotted itself like winter's cold, split down the middle, a dangerous parity. A tie meant a need for the Àlpha's arbitration, and her father's face when he entered the den later was a map of contradictions. He had been a man who taught Isolde to listen to the forest as a ledger of truth and falsehood alike, but he was also a leader with a crown to keep. His eyes fell on Jonah with the weariness of someone who had learned to count cost. "You know our laws," he said evenly. "A bond with a human is unprecedented. It risks fracturing the Thorns beyond repair." "Then perhaps it is a chance to remake them," Isolde answered. "Perhaps leadership should be what keeps people alive, not what polishes the pack's reputation." Her father's breath left him like a small surrender. "We will not be rash," he decided. "An inquiry will be made. If Jonah is found innocent of collusion, then he may remain under constraints." Under constraints. The words were an iron cage made into a gift. Isolde felt anger bloom, hot and ragged. Constraints were the pack's way of saying yes and meaning no. Jonah's chin lifted. He did not look like a man who planned to be caged for the sake of others' comfort. "Constraints won't stop the Black Rose from testing us again," Jonah said quietly. "If they want to use me as a wedge, they will. You need to decide who you are now, not for their stories, but for your people's survival." The inquiry began like a sickness. It seeped into the easy rhythm of the den and slurred conversations into suspicions. Jonah answered questions about his past with the blunt currency of truth. He spoke of the leader he'd treated, of the choice that had made enemies, of the night he had learned that mercy was sometimes treason in the mouths of those who prized dominance. He did not ask for absolution. He simply told, and the telling made some uncomfortable, because truth tends to be inconvenient. But the thornier fractures were not in Jonah's confession. They were in the way the thorns reacted to it. Some pity turned to contempt, some gratitude to calculation. Isolde watched as faces she had known her whole life rearranged themselves into strangers. A cousin who once taught her to read the wind now assessed her as if a new law had rendered her illegible. A friend who had once offered her a place by the inner fire now avoided her glance, perhaps calculating whether proximity to scandal would stain their own standing. Worse, Jonah's past became a scalpel in competitor mouths. Alder's supporters sharpened the accusation into a narrative they could sell to the elders. Isolde, the broken heiress, had chosen a man known to weaken dominance. Therefore, the pack's future should be entrusted to a line that could still be believed in with eyes open and claws ready. It was subtle, polite bloodletting. Murder of reputation is darker because it leaves bodies intact and spirits broken. Isolde confronted Alder in the shadow of the outer wall, where pines blurred the sun and his voice dropped into the close air. "You use fear as fuel for your climb," she said. "If your ambition needs me diminished, what kind of leader are you?" Alder's reply was a smile that tasted like iron. "A leader who keeps the pack safe," he said. "This isn't about you. It's about survival." "Then preserve people, not appearances," she snapped back. "You speak like a man who believes theological purity keeps wolves alive." The argument was less a fight than a fracture cracking open to show the rot within. Alder walked away as if he had not just been confronted. His stride was all practiced politics. Isolde felt smaller in the wake of it, like someone who had been trimmed back to see the branches left. She returned to the den and found Jonah tending the wounded Beta's shoulder again, fingers patient and sure. "They will try to smear you both," he said when she sat, "not because of facts, but because of fear. They will craft a story where you're the cost and I'll be the instrument." "I know," she replied. "I also know that I cannot become something I am not to make them comfortable." A silence folded around them. And then the den's door stuttered. A scout dashed in, breath of a hunted animal. "A rider from Black Row," he panted. "They seek parley. They bring a messenger and a prisoner." Isolde's heart became lead again. A prisoner meant more than a man folded in rope. It meant proof they could wave, a living accusation to brand Jonah and, by extension, her. She rose as if propelled by a muscle memory forged in indignation. When the messenger arrived, hooded and caged in arrogance, Isolde heard the Black Row's voice as a thing meant to humiliate. Calm, slow, confident in the spectacle they brought. A young lichen scout bound with rope, eyes bruised from being held. "We offer a bargain," the Black Row announced. "We will keep our borders if you cast out the human agent who weakened our kin." Isolde's hands found Jonah's. The den's world contracted to the small place of their clasp. Around them, the thorns shifted like a sleeping thing nudged by a hand. Her father listened, jaw a hard line. The elders murmured like a verdict forming. "Release him," Isolde said. Voice small, but the sound of a bell in a crowded market. "We will not make a life currency for rumor. We will not trade a man for a story." Alder's expression soured. He mouthed the word treason as if to taste it. The Black Rose smiled, tasting triumph. The stallion of politics had reared. The thorns were about to decide whether to sell their soul for calm. Jonah stepped forward then, unbound by fear or shame. "Take me instead," he offered. The room inhaled like a mouth full of cold air. The offer was a dagger and a mercy both. He would exchange himself so Isolde's people would stand unbroken, if that was their choice. The gesture was not a plea, it was a sacrifice, clean and terrible. Isolde's world narrowed to the sound of his voice. "You cannot barter yourself," she said, words strangled by sudden panic. "I can," Jonah replied. "I have been more anonymous than this. If my becoming a symbol saves the thorns of war, then so be it. But I refuse to be used to shame you." Her father moved at last, a man torn between a daughter's plea and a pack's safety. "We will not hand over one of our own," he said, and a new wind breathed through the den. It was neither victory nor surrender, but a living compromise. Isolde felt relief that was wolf and human both, sharp, sudden, almost disbelief. The Black Row leader sneered and backed away, eyes narrowed, the promise of more danger in their step. They left with a final barb. "Then watch your loyalties. When mercy weakens you, wolves will bite." The words hung like smoke as they rode away. In the aftermath, the den hummed with the sound of people tending not only bodies but reputations. Isolde watched as her people turned their gaze inward and outward, no longer sure which was safer. Some retreated into the old certainties, but others, fewer, braver, began to approach Jonah with the residue of gratitude and curiosity rather than suspicion. Yet fractures had been made. Loyalty stretched thin. Her mother's look of sorrow now felt like a ledger entry. Alder's quiet calculation had widened into open maneuvering. She could see words being placed in mouths that would later be used as stones. And the Black Row's promise of return hovered, a dark weather front. A new fear threaded the pack. Maybe mercy would call down more teeth. That night, as a thin frost edged the den's mouth and the world tightened, Isolde and Jonah sat apart from the others. He had a cloth pressed to a small burn on his forearm. She listened to how the pack breathed when the world around them had almost been lost to rumor. "They will try to break us," she said, not as prophecy, but as the naming of fact. "We'll be broken and mended," Jonah answered. "That's always the way of people who keep doing the hard work." She looked at him then, at the tired set of his jaw and the way his hand found hers as if by habit. Something between them had already frayed and been stitched back, an intimate mending that the pack would not yet understand. But as the night folded around the den, Isolde understood with a fierce clarity that some fractures were meant to make room for truths that could not be seen but could be felt. She would not be the pack's cautionary tale. She would be, if she could, the reason its definition of strength changed. Outside the den, the flags snapped under a wind that had not decided whether to carry storm or clearing. Inside, two hands held each other in the dark, an unremarked treaty between a blind, limping Harris and a human who had given up more than was asked. The thorns had new wounds to stitch and new questions to answer. The fracture had been made. Now the real danger was watching how the pack chose to heal. They came at dawn, with the sky the color of old bones and a silence that felt like a held breath. Isolde woke to the sound of hurried tongues and the metallic hitch of saddles. Jonah was already up, hand steady despite the bruise darkening his cheek. And when their eyes met in the dim, no words were needed, only the kind of agreement that had been carved by threat and choice. The Black Rows had returned faster than anyone expected, and with them came a new gambit. They would not only trade tales, they wanted a show of submission. They wanted the Thorns to hand over Jonah or hand over Isolde's claim. The meeting in the clearing was designed for spectacle. Flags snapped like admonitions. Elders formed their slow circle. Alder wore authority like armor. The Black Row leader stood opposite him, a mountain of fur and teeth, and his messenger, two human riders this time, bold and cruel, spoke plainly into the open. Give us the human who twice softened a leader, and we will leave your borders. Or else. Isolde's father moved first, measured by years of rule and the weight of lineage. He looked at Jonah as if weighing a blade. The crowd breathed history. Then Jonah stepped forward like a man stepping into the teeth of rumor and offered his own throat to save a pack that had not entirely welcomed him. "I take the blame," Jonah said, voice steady as struck flint. "I will go with you. I will answer whatever you demand." The Black Row leader barked a laugh that tasted like victory. But before the bargain could be sealed, Isolde did something the Thorns had never expected from the heiress who limped and carried night inside her. She stepped in front of Jonah. "You will not take him," she said, and the clearing inhaled as if struck. She knew the risk with the cold clarity of bone. Standing between an enemy and the human they wanted to use as a weapon painted a target across her chest. But when Jonah's eyes found hers, there was no doubt. His offer had not been for glory. He had meant it as protection. Now she reclaimed that protection back. "Then take me instead," she said, surprising even her own voice by its calm. "Bind me and drag me across your borders if you must, but nothing of ours will be used to assert your lies." The Black Rows snarled. Their leader's smile thinned. To them, it was a theater, an Àlpha born to command, idiotically offering her life for a human. To Isolde, it was a claim she had already made with a dozen tiny decisions, refusing to be made a cautionary tale, choosing the man who had saved their blood, not their honor. Her father barked the oldest threat in his repertoire: loss of heir, exile, shame. And for a moment the choice hung like a knife edge. Then Alder moved, his voice a whisper of poison. "If she gives herself, we lose the line," he said. "You would be the end of our future." Isolde's laugh was soft, edged with something hungry. "Our future is not preserved by burying mercy," she said. "It is preserved by keeping the living." Jonah reached for her hand. His fingers closed around hers, and in that touch was 1,000 unspoken apologies and promises. "I will not let you do this," he said. "Then you will not be my martyr for fear's sake," she answered. "We both stand. We either change what thorn means, or we die clinging to what it used to be." The Black Rows readied fury, but a ripple ran through the Thorns. A few younger betas, their eyes wet with a new dismay at the idea of trading life for face, stepped forward to stand beside Isolde. Their loyalty was not to spectacle, but to the living bodies at their feet. The elders shifted. History is heavier than pride when the present demands it. Alder's calculation turned to maneuvering. He saw not only danger, but opportunity. His teeth showed. He was not ready to lose authority to the unknown. Yet even his strategy had to bend to the simple fact that the Thorns had just been offered a version of themselves they might be proud to keep. If they pushed Jonah over the cliff, they would be choosing rumor over rescue, blood over life. The standoff lasted like a winter, long, wind-washed. Words were traded, bargains hinted. At the moment when a Black Row hand hovered for the cut rope, Jonah did something both reckless and heroic. He pressed his forehead to Isolde's, eyes closed, voice a whisper meant for no one but her. "If they take me," he breathed, "remember to lead with the heart you have. Let mercy be a law." Isolde tasted salt and copper, the small sharpness of fear, and something softer, absolution. "No," she said, fierce, "we win this together." She reached for the pelt of her father's old cloak, the weight of his rule folded into cheap cloth. With steady fingers she tore a strip, tied it around Jonah's wrist, a binding not of chains but of claim. and then she tied another strip through her own belt. 2 knots, 2 promises. The thorns murmured, some in outrage, some in astonishment. A human and an heiress, linked not by ceremony, but by deliberate, public defiance. The Black Rose hissed and rode back. Their leader's pride stung more than their teeth. They had wanted spectacle, not stubborn unity. As they turned, their leader spat a final threat. "This will not end. We'll return with more than words." Isolde felt the rumble of the threat like a skittering in her bones, and the thrill of choice like a new muscle in her chest. She had claimed Jonah not to break the pack, but to remold it. Sacrifice had been offered. She had refused to let the sacrifice be only one person's burden. In the wake of the Black Rose retreat, the thorns gathered around their fires in a different arrangement. Some came to Jonah with questions, others with guarded thanks. In the den later, where wounds were bound and rumors settled like dust, Jonah looked at Isolde with a softness that broke something like a dam. "You tied yourself to me," he said, voice a rough hush. "You could have saved the pack without risking your claim." "And I would have lost you," she replied, thumb tracing the band on his wrist. "I would have proven everything they already thought, that I can be sacrificed and still obey." "I would rather risk my life for the man who chose to stand than live to be used as proof of tradition." He leaned in, forehead to forehead, breath warm and human and real. Then, "Well, be dangerous together," he whispered. "Well, change them." "Well, make them see with hands and with hearts," she answered. The pact was not a formal bond of blood. It was something younger and fiercer, a decision to stand as one. Outside, the flags flapped in a wind that felt like the beginning of weather. Inside, Isolde and Jonah claimed each other, not as currency, not as a spectacle, but as partnership. It was imperfect, vulnerable, and utterly theirs. A redemption bought with courage, a claim sealed by sacrifice. They sat by the outer fire as dusk bled into a slow, honest dark. The den hummed with repaired breaths and the soft scrape of needles. Isolde listened to small sounds, the way Jonah folded fabric, the rhythm of a beta's cough, the distant rasp of flags. Each noise stitched the world back together in a language she could understand. The elders argued into the night, but their voices softened when a life needed tending. The thorns had not become certain, but they had shifted like a stone turned in a riverbed. Some eyes still measured her as less. Some hands reached to help without asking why. Jonah moved among them with a quiet that was no longer apologetic, but earned. Children peered from behind pelts and learned how a human could mend a wolf. His past did not vanish, but it dulled against the constancy of care. Isolde found herself teaching small lessons too, how to hold a knife for split fur, how to read the silence after thunder. She taught without the need to prove that sight defined authority. The pack watched these moments and slowly remembered that usefulness and mercy were not enemies. Her mother came to the outer fire one evening, hands folded and eyes wide as if handling glass. She did not offer apologies fashioned into the weight of law. Instead, she sat, fingers fumbling, and laid a worn pelt across Isolde's knees. "You were right to stand," she said, voice brittle and honest. The acceptance was small and late, but it unspooled a relief that had been coiled in Isolde's ribs for years. Alder's presence thinned. He circled, still a threat, but fewer betas followed his shadow without question. The inquiry resolved quietly. Constraints remained, but with a touch softened by the pack's need to keep living wolves. Black Row threats did not vanish, but their teeth could not chew at a unity they had not expected. Days folded into a rhythm of patrols, of healed shoulders, of Jonah and Isolde walking the borders hand in hand. They practiced commands together, Isolde's voice steady, and Jonah translating the clipped nuances into human cadence. Where once she had felt fragmented, she felt coherence stitch into bone. The bundle of their small rebellion became a lesson. Leadership could be chosen and taught, not inherited as a flawless mask. They stepped to the border at dawn, bound, hands knotted, promising a new thorn.